I remember I was 7 years old when I first met the Tooth Fairy. It was a rainy evening in our old, creaky cottage on the edge of the forest. It all started with an innocent tooth that fell out while I was playing. My mom told me then to put it under my pillow, and in return I would find a coin in the morning. Excited by this prospect, I followed her advice. That night I couldn't sleep for a long time. The sound of rain and the crack of thunder sent shivers down my spine. When I finally managed to close my eyes, I was awakened by a strange rustling sound from under the bed. My heart froze in my chest, and my body was covered in cold sweat. I heard a quiet, prolonged scratching, which resembled the scraping of sharp claws on the wooden floor. Suddenly, a figure slowly began to emerge from under the bed. Her long, bony fingers, ending in sharp, yellowed claws, dug into the floor with incredible force, and the terrifying noises she made suggested that every movement caused her unimaginable pain. Her silhouette was tall and thin, as if made only of bones and skin, which had a rotten green hue covered with wrinkled and cracked patches. From these cracks oozed a black sticky substance resembling tar. As she crawled toward me, a quiet metallic giggle escaped her mouth, penetrating me to the core. Her eyes were like portals leading straight to the deepest abysses of hell, devoid of any sign of life, in the depths of which lurked unspeakable horror. Her mouth slowly stretched into an unnatural, sinister grin, revealing a row of sharp, yellowed teeth that looked like they could tear any victim to shreds. Her hair was long, black, and tangled, resembling a spider web, in which were trapped the remains of insects, small animal bones, and scraps of skin. A stench of decay emanated from her body, filling the entire room in an instant, and an unnatural cold spread all around. Before I could scream, she sat on my chest, paralyzing me with fear. Her icy hands tightened around my neck, and I couldn't move or make a sound. I felt her claws digging into my skin, and her breath, smelling of decay, enveloped my face. Each breath was like a foul exhalation from an open grave, and the icy touch of her fingers pierced me like thousands of needles. My heart pounded wildly, and I had only one thought in my head: run. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Her eyes scrutinized me, as if examining every inch of my body, and her grin grew wider and more malevolent. A quiet, sinister chuckle emanated from her throat, sounding like the echo of dead souls. She took my tooth from under the pillow, but that was not enough for her. Her hungry, inhuman eyes shifted to my younger brother, Jacob, who was sleeping next to me, unaware of the nightmare unfolding right beside him. Her gaze became even more insistent, and drool began to drip from her mouth as if she already imagined the taste of his innocence. Each of her movements was slow, methodical, like a predator stalking its helpless prey. I felt time stand still, and my helplessness was like a death sentence hanging in the air. Then I remembered the small runic stone my grandfather had given me for my 7th birthday. It was a smooth gray stone with an ancient symbol carved into it, which my grandfather always carried with him, saying it protected against evil. With difficulty, I reached out to the nightstand where the stone lay. My fingers trembled, but I finally managed to grab it. I lifted the stone and pointed it at the Tooth Fairy. A look of pure terror appeared on her face, as if she had seen something that was her absolute nightmare. She began to scream, and her scream filled the entire room, penetrating the walls and echoing in my ears. Her body began to shake, and more black, sticky substance started to ooze from her skin. The runic stone began to emit a bright, silvery light that seemed to burn the Tooth Fairy from the inside. A horrifying, inhuman scream escaped her mouth, and then she started to retreat, as if the stone's light was unbearable for her. Finally, she disappeared into the shadow. As soon as she vanished, the stone in my hand began to flicker and heat up until it finally evaporated into the air, as if it had used up all its power. I collapsed onto the bed, breathing heavily, but knowing that this time I had managed to drive her away. A few days had passed since the terrifying encounter with the Tooth Fairy, and I still couldn't forget what had happened. The nights were sleepless, and every shadow seemed to threaten another nightmare. After many of my pleas, my mom agreed that I could visit my grandfather. She knew he was an eccentric man, but loved and trusted him deeply. One morning after breakfast, I set off through the forest that led to his house. The forest seemed gloomier than ever, and every rustle of leaves reminded me of that dreadful night. Eventually, I reached a small wooden cabin surrounded by old trees. I knocked on the door, and my grandfather opened it almost immediately. His face, marked with wrinkles and experience, grew serious as soon as he saw my expression.
"What happened, boy?"
He asked, leading me to the kitchen and handing me a warm tea. With difficulty, I told him about what had happened a few nights earlier. I described the terrifying figure of the Tooth Fairy, her icy touch, the stench of decay, and the way she disappeared after coming into contact with the runic stone. My grandfather listened intently, his eyes growing more worried.
"I knew this day might come,"
he said when I finished speaking.
"That creature, the Tooth Fairy, is an ancient evil. The runic stone I gave you was meant to protect you from such evil, but its power is not infinite."
He paused for a moment as if considering how to convey the next information to me.
"You must know that the fairy may return. If she finds a way to regain her full power, she will be even more dangerous."
His voice was low and full of gravity.
"If that happens, take your brother and run to my house as fast as you can. You need to know that I built it on sacred ground, and the area around it is secured with ancient protective rituals."
I looked at him, surprised and full of questions. "How do you know all this, Grandpa?" I asked, unable to hide my astonishment. My grandfather smiled sadly, looking into the distance, as if recalling long-forgotten memories.
"It's a long story, boy,"
he began, his voice becoming quieter and more reflective.
"In my youth, I traveled the world, seeking knowledge and answers to questions that had tormented me since childhood. I met many extraordinary people and learned things that most people have no idea about. Old masters, shamans, and sages shared their secrets with me, and I vowed to use that knowledge to protect my family."
He paused for a moment as if gathering his thoughts, then continued.
"Some of these rituals and spells are as old as the earth itself. This knowledge is powerful, but also dangerous. The Tooth Fairy is one of many ancient beings that roam our world, seeking the weak and innocent. But don't worry, boy. Now that you know the truth, we can prepare and face this threat together."
I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. I knew I couldn't let evil threaten my family again. My grandfather was sure that together we could face this threat, but it required courage and determination from me that I had never even dreamed of. "I'll be ready," I finally said, looking my grandfather straight in the eye. "I'll do everything in my power to protect our family." My grandfather smiled sadly, placing his hand on my shoulder.
"I know you will, boy."
A year had passed since those terrifying events, and life was slowly returning to normal. During that time, I intensely studied the book my grandfather gave me. It spoke of old legends and myths, which, as it turned out, had much in common with the truth. The book was full of dusty pages written in ancient runes and symbols. Every evening after finishing my chores, I sat at my desk and delved into the knowledge hidden in the book. I learned about various beings that once roamed our world, bringing fear and destruction with them. It described methods of defense against them, ancient rituals designed to protect against evil. The book also spoke of various talismans and amulets that had the power to ward off evil spirits. Unfortunately, the runic stone that once saved me was unique, and its power was used up that dreadful night. Unfortunately, despite its power, the artifact did not completely destroy the monster, and when I least expected it, the nightmare returned. It was a peaceful night. My mother had put us to bed long ago. When I fell asleep, I was awakened by the quiet creaking of the wardrobe. My heart began to beat faster and cold sweat covered my body. Slowly, I looked towards the wardrobe, and there, in the shadows, I saw a pair of eerie, red eyes. The Tooth Fairy had returned. Mom! I screamed, unable to hide my terror. My mother rushed into the room, her face expressing exhaustion and concern.
What happened, honey?
She asked, trying to calm me down. There's a monster in the wardrobe, I whispered, pointing a trembling hand at the wardrobe door.
Monsters don't exist.
My mother said, trying to smile reassuringly.
I'll show you.
Approaching the wardrobe with determination, she opened the door. At that moment, something invisible grabbed her and pulled her inside with terrifying force. I heard her muffled screams and the sounds of desperate struggle. A cold terror paralyzed me for a moment. Suddenly, a fountain of blood burst from the wardrobe, splattering everywhere, and my mother's dismembered body fell to the floor with a thud. The horror took my breath away as I watched this gruesome scene, unable to react. The Tooth Fairy emerged from the wardrobe, her face smeared with blood, and her eyes gleaming with pure, unrestrained evil. Her inhuman smile betrayed an insatiable hunger, which she now directed at me and my younger brother Jacob. I felt her approaching us with each step, her presence like an icy gust of dread. I grabbed Jacob's hand and we ran out of the house without looking back. The night was dark and the moon barely pierced through the thick clouds. We ran through the forest, feeling the Tooth Fairy chasing us. Her sinister laughter echoed among the trees, penetrating us to the bone. Branches scratched our faces and roots grabbed our feet, as if the forest itself had conspired against us. Our legs burned with effort, but fear gave us strength. Finally, we reached our grandfather's house, a wooden cabin surrounded by ancient trees. I knocked with all my might, and my grandfather opened the door almost immediately. Seeing our terrified faces,
What happened?
he asked, his eyes shining with determination. The Tooth Fairy, she's back, I gasped, barely catching my breath. Grandfather immediately understood what was happening. Without a word, he pulled us inside and bolted the door. He quickly lit candles and sprinkled a circle of salt around us, reciting ancient incantations. His voice was strong and sure, each word sounding like a decree. The Tooth Fairy appeared in the doorway, her body radiating a dark, malevolent aura. Her inhuman eyes burned with evil, and the smile that appeared on her face was full of hatred.
You cannot enter here.
Grandfather shouted, holding an old ritual book in his hand.
This is sacred ground, and your evil has no place here.
The Tooth Fairy hissed and screamed, trying to break the barrier. But my grandfather's ancient spells were stronger. He continued the ritual, his voice growing louder. In one hand, he held a silver bell that began to ring, producing pure high tones. And in the other, an ancient amulet that emitted a blue light. Each sound of the bell seemed to burn the Tooth Fairy from the inside. Her body shook and a terrifying, inhuman scream came from her mouth. The light of the amulet began to pulse and the Tooth Fairy retreated, as if the light and sound were unbearable for her. Grandfather raised the book and uttered the final words of the spell, and the amulet shone with a bright light that filled the entire room. Finally, the Tooth Fairy began to retreat, her body dissolving into the darkness until she disappeared completely. The scream stopped, and the silence that followed was both frightening and full of relief. We were safe, but I knew I would never forget what had happened. Grandfather approached us, placing a hand on my shoulder.
Now you understand why this knowledge is so important,
he said quietly. I felt relieved, but at the same time, I knew it was only the beginning. That night, my brother and I lost our mother. Her death was a brutal reminder that evil never sleeps and that we cannot afford a moment of weakness. Over time, Grandfather became our teacher and mentor, passing on his knowledge of ancient rituals and protective spells. Every day, as I looked at Jacob, I reminded myself that I had to be strong for him, just as our mother had been for us. I knew her sacrifice could not be in vain. So I decided that from then on I would delve into ancient knowledge, which I would then use to fight evil and protect those I love.